What if the moments you label as your weakest are actually moments when the old version of you can no longer survive? Most people see a breakdown as failure because it feels like losing control. Your thoughts scatter, your emotions overwhelm you, your routines collapse. But psychologically, breakdowns often occur when your internal system has reached a limit. The identity you've been using, the beliefs you've been clinging to, the emotional armor you've relied on, they stop working. And when something stops working, it doesn't gently fade away, it breaks. That breaking isn't random, it's pressure revealing truth. A breakdown is rarely about one bad day or one bad event. It's the result of accumulation, years of suppressing emotion, tolerating misalignment, shrinking yourself to fit expectations, or pushing through pain without processing it. The nervous system keeps score even when the mind pretends everything is fine. Eventually, the body and psyche demand attention in the only language they have left: overwhelm. This is why breakdowns often feel sudden to the outside world, but inevitable to the person experiencing them. Something inside you has been asking to change long before it collapses. There is a hidden intelligence in emotional collapse. When you can no longer function the way you used to, it forces awareness. The distractions stop working. The coping mechanisms lose power. You're confronted with yourself without the usual filters. This is uncomfortable because clarity rarely arrives politely. It arrives through discomfort. But this confrontation is precisely where growth begins. Not motivational growth, but structural growth. The kind where you don't just feel better, you become different. Many people try to rush out of their breakdowns as fast as possible, treating them like emergencies to escape rather than messages to understand. But avoidance is what created the breakdown in the first place. When you slow down and observe what is falling apart, patterns emerge. You start noticing which relationships drain you, which beliefs are borrowed, which goals no longer feel authentic. The breakdown exposes the misalignment between who you've been performing as and who you actually are. And that exposure, while painful, is clarifying. Your mind often breaks down right before a belief collapses. A belief about your worth, your limits, your responsibility to carry everything alone. The distress isn't just emotional, it's cognitive. Your old explanations for your life stop making sense. You begin questioning narratives you once accepted without resistance. This is dangerous territory for the ego because certainty feels safer than truth. But breakthroughs don't come from certainty. They come from questions you're finally brave enough to ask. Breakdowns strip away illusion. They reveal where you've been living on autopilot, repeating behaviors that no longer align with your values. This is why people often emerge from intense emotional periods with sharper boundaries, clearer priorities, and a reduced tolerance for nonsense. They didn't become stronger because the pain toughened them. They became stronger because the pain forced honesty, and honesty changes behavior. There's also a biological component that most people ignore. During prolonged stress, the brain is wired for survival, not reflection. A breakdown often signals a shift from survival mode to processing mode. Emotions that were postponed come rushing in. Memories resurface. Grief you didn't have time to feel demands attention. This isn't regression, it's integration. You can't move forward carrying unresolved weight forever. At some point, the system stops and says, deal with this now. Not every breakdown leads to a breakthrough automatically. The difference lies in response. Some people numb, distract, or rebuild the same patterns with new justifications. Others listen. They sit with discomfort long enough to extract meaning from it. Those are the people who change at a core level. They don't just recover, they reconfigure. They stop trying to return to who they were before and start becoming someone more aligned with who they are now. What makes breakdowns terrifying is also what makes them powerful. They dissolve certainty. But certainty is often a cage disguised as stability. When it cracks, you're forced into the unknown. And while the unknown feels threatening, it's also where choice lives. You can't choose differently if nothing has broken. You can't redesign your life if you're still clinging to a structure that no longer fits. The version of you that emerges after a true internal collapse is rarely louder or more confident in a superficial way. It's quieter, clearer, less reactive, less willing to betray itself for comfort or approval. That shift doesn't come from inspiration. It comes from consequence, from finally understanding at a deep level what it costs to ignore yourself. Many people look back on their hardest moments not with gratitude for the pain, but with respect for what it revealed. The breakdown didn't give them answers. It removed lies. And once the lies were gone, the next step became unavoidable. When a breakdown occurs, it often feels like you're losing yourself. But psychologically, what's really happening is that the false coherence you've been maintaining begins to dissolve. Humans are incredibly skilled at constructing inner stories that allow them to keep functioning, even when those stories are no longer true. You tell yourself you're fine, that this is normal, that everyone feels this way, that you'll deal with it later. Over time, that internal narrative requires more energy to sustain than it gives back. A breakdown is the moment the mind can no longer justify the story. The tension between what you tell yourself and what you feel becomes unbearable, and the psyche chooses collapse over continued self-deception. Emotionally, breakdowns are not just about sadness or anxiety, they're about exposure. Emotions you've learned to manage through control suddenly spill beyond containment. Shame surfaces because control has been central to your identity. Fear intensifies because the rules you lived by no longer apply. This is why people often feel embarrassed by their breakdowns, even in private. It feels like being seen by yourself, without makeup, without armor, without performance. Yet this raw exposure is essential. You cannot heal what you refuse to fully experience. There is also grief embedded in most breakdowns, grief for time lost, for versions of yourself that never got to exist, for needs that went unmet for too long. This grief doesn't announce itself clearly. It disguises itself as irritability, numbness, exhaustion, or sudden emotional swings. Many people mistake this grief for weakness or instability, but it is actually the psyche recalibrating. You are mourning illusions you once relied on, and mourning is not passive, it is transformative. One of the most destabilizing aspects of a breakdown is identity erosion. The roles you've used to define yourself, strong one, reliable one, fixer, achiever, caretaker, begin to feel hollow or even oppressive. When these roles collapse, it can feel like emptiness, but that emptiness is not absence, it's space. Space where a more authentic identity can form, one not built solely around survival strategies or external validation. The discomfort comes from not knowing who you are yet, not from being nothing. Emotionally, this period can feel chaotic because the nervous system is renegotiating safety. What once felt safe, predictability, approval, over-functioning, may now feel threatening. Meanwhile, unfamiliar states like rest, honesty, or vulnerability feel unsafe simply because they're new. This reversal can be deeply confusing. You may feel guilt for wanting things you never allowed yourself to want, or fear for letting go of patterns that once protected you. But protection is not the same as growth, and your system is learning the difference. Breakdowns also reveal where emotional boundaries were never formed. When everything collapses, you often see clearly where you've been absorbing emotions that were never yours to carry. Other people's expectations, other people's moods, other people's unresolved pain. The exhaustion you feel isn't from doing too much, it's from carrying too much. This realization can be painful because it forces responsibility, not for others, but for yourself. Responsibility to choose differently moving forward. There is often a period during a breakdown where nothing seems meaningful. Motivation disappears. Old goals lose their pull. This isn't laziness or apathy, it's a psychological pause. The mind is disengaging from pursuits that no longer align with your values. Meaning doesn't vanish. It goes quiet while it reorganizes. This is why rushing to feel normal again can be counterproductive. Normal may be what broke you. Emotionally, the breakdown strips away emotional shortcuts. You can no longer bypass discomfort with distraction, productivity, or optimism. You are forced into presence, forced into listening. This can feel unbearable at first, but presence is where insight lives. It's where you start noticing subtle emotional truths you've ignored. Resentment, where you said yes too often. Loneliness, where you pretended independence. Anger, where you called it patience. Over time, if you stay with this process, something subtle but profound begins to shift. You stop asking, "How do I fix this?" and start asking, "What is this teaching me?" That question changes everything. It turns suffering into information. It transforms pain from an enemy into a messenger. And once pain is understood, it no longer needs to scream. This phase doesn't make you fearless. It makes you honest. And honesty is far more powerful than fearlessness, because it guides your decisions when motivation fades. You begin choosing based on alignment rather than approval, based on self-respect rather than obligation. The breakdown hasn't ended yet, but something inside you has already begun to reorganize. Trauma patterns are often the invisible architecture beneath repeated breakdowns. Trauma doesn't always come from dramatic events. It often forms through chronic emotional neglect, unpredictability, or the pressure to be someone you had to be in order to be accepted. When these patterns go unexamined, the nervous system learns to live in a constant state of alert. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Overfunctioning becomes safety. Emotional suppression becomes control. A breakdown occurs when the nervous system can no longer sustain that state. Repair doesn't begin with positive thinking. It begins with regulation. Learning to feel safe in the body again. Slowing breath, reducing stimulation, allowing emotions to rise without judgment. This isn't weakness, it's rewiring. Nervous system repair is subtle and often misunderstood. It's not about eliminating stress, but about expanding your capacity to experience it without collapse. Trauma narrows tolerance. Small disruptions feel catastrophic because the body remembers threat even when the present moment is safe. Repair happens when you repeatedly show your system that it can experience discomfort without danger following, rest without guilt, boundaries without punishment, stillness without collapse. Over time, the nervous system learns that calm is not abandonment and that slowing down does not mean falling behind. This is where many people diverge. Some repeat breakdowns while others evolve. The difference isn't strength or intelligence, it's awareness. People who repeat breakdowns often rebuild their lives on the same internal blueprint. They change circumstances, but not patterns. New job, same overwork. New relationship, same emotional abandonment of self. New routines, same avoidance of core wounds. The nervous system recognizes familiarity, not health. So it recreates what it knows, even if it hurts. Those who evolve do something uncomfortable. They interrupt the pattern. They pause where they used to push. They feel where they used to numb. They say no where they used to perform. This initially creates anxiety because growth feels like danger to a system trained by trauma. But over time, these small interruptions accumulate. The nervous system updates. The breakdown doesn't repeat because the pressure no longer builds the same way. Repeated breakdowns are often signals that lessons are being avoided, not that something is wrong with you. The psyche is persistent. If a message isn't received the first time, it will be delivered again, louder. This is not punishment, it's insistence. Life keeps presenting the same emotional themes until they are integrated. Boundaries, self-worth, grief, autonomy, expression. When these themes are honored, the need for collapse diminishes. Silence and stillness play a role here that most people underestimate. We live in a culture that treats noise as productivity and distraction as relief. But breakthroughs don't occur in noise. Noise keeps you oriented outward. Stillness turns you inward. Silence removes the constant input that tells you who to be, what to want, and how to feel. In silence, your own voice becomes audible again, and that can be unsettling if you've ignored it for years. Stillness initially amplifies discomfort because it removes escape routes. Thoughts get louder before they soften. Emotions surface before they settle. This is why many people avoid stillness altogether. But if you stay, something shifts. The mind begins to distinguish between fear-based thoughts and truth-based awareness. You start recognizing which thoughts are echoes of the past and which belong to the present. Silence creates discernment. In stillness, the nervous system recalibrates. Without constant stimulation, the body remembers how to rest without collapse. You begin to feel sensations again, subtle cues that guide decision-making long before logic catches up. This embodied awareness becomes the foundation of breakthroughs, not dramatic insights, but quiet clarity, a sense of this no longer fits or this feels right without needing external validation. Silence also dissolves urgency. Breakdowns often feel urgent because the mind is racing toward resolution. Stillness slows time subjectively. It allows integration instead of reaction. In this space, solutions emerge organically, not forced. You don't think your way into a breakthrough, you allow it to surface once the system feels safe enough to reorganize. As trauma patterns soften, repetition loses its grip. As the nervous system repairs, resilience replaces reactivity. As silence becomes tolerable, clarity becomes inevitable. The breakdown is no longer something you fear or rush through. It becomes a threshold, a crossing point between who you were conditioned to be and who you are becoming. As this process deepens, something important happens that many people don't expect. Your relationship with pain itself begins to change. Pain stops feeling like an enemy that must be eliminated and starts feeling like data. Instead of asking, "How do I make this stop?" you begin asking, "What is this pointing toward?" This shift is subtle but powerful. It moves you out of panic and into observation. When pain becomes information, it loses its ability to dominate you. It may still hurt, but it no longer controls the direction of your life. You may notice that your emotional reactions slow down, not because you're numb, but because you're no longer hijacked. Triggers that once sent you spiraling now create pauses instead. In those pauses, choice appears. This is one of the clearest signs that a breakdown is transforming into a breakthrough. You are no longer reacting from old survival scripts. You are responding from awareness. That difference is everything. At this stage, many people experience an internal loneliness that feels different from isolation. It's not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of separation from old identities and old crowds. You may feel less interested in explaining yourself, defending your choices, or participating in conversations that revolve around surface-level concerns. This can feel disorienting at first, but it's actually a sign of internal consolidation. You're no longer fragmenting yourself to belong. You're becoming more whole, even if that wholeness is quieter. This is also where discernment sharpens. You begin noticing how much of your previous life was driven by urgency, fear of falling behind, or fear of disappointing others. That urgency fades. In its place comes selectiveness. You become careful with your energy, your time, your emotional availability, not because you're closed off, but because you finally recognize your limits as sacred rather than negotiable. This protects you from recreating the same conditions that led to collapse. If this perspective is resonating with you, if it's helping you see your own struggles with more clarity and self-respect, take a moment to support this channel by liking this video, sharing it with someone who may need it, and subscribing to PSYCHOVEST. These ideas reach more people when you engage, and your support helps this space continue to exist for deeper conversations like this one. As awareness grows, another important realization often surfaces. Healing is not linear, and progress is not dramatic. Breakthroughs rarely look like instant relief. They look like fewer betrayals of self, like leaving earlier when something feels wrong, like resting before exhaustion forces it, like choosing honesty over harmony. These changes may feel small, but they are structural. They change the direction of your life over time. You may still have difficult days, emotional waves still come, but they no longer define you, they move through you. This is nervous system resilience in action, not emotional numbness, not forced positivity, but capacity, the ability to feel deeply without being consumed, the ability to experience discomfort without interpreting it as danger. This is the quiet strength that emerges on the other side of a breakdown. As this new stability settles in, you may start noticing a subtle but profound shift in how you relate to your thoughts. Thoughts that once felt authoritative now feel negotiable. You no longer assume that every critical voice in your head is telling the truth. Instead, you recognize patterns, old internalized messages, repeating themselves out of habit rather than relevance. This awareness weakens their grip. The mind becomes a space you inhabit, not a place you are trapped inside. That distinction changes everything. Emotionally, you begin to experience feelings without immediately needing to label, explain, or resolve them. There's a growing tolerance for ambiguity. You realize that not every emotion requires action, and not every uncomfortable feeling is a problem to fix. This allows emotions to complete their natural cycle instead of lingering. When emotions are allowed to move, they don't harden into identity. They pass through, leaving insight rather than residue. Another shift that often emerges is a deeper trust in timing. Before the breakdown, you may have lived with constant pressure to decide, act, or prove something. Afterward, urgency loosens its hold. You become more patient with uncertainty because you've seen what happens when you ignore internal signals. This patience isn't passive, it's attentive. You're listening more closely, responding more intentionally, and allowing clarity to form instead of forcing it. You may also notice a reduction in emotional reactivity toward others, not because you care less, but because you're no longer seeking regulation through external validation. When someone is upset, disappointed, or distant, it doesn't automatically register as your responsibility or your failure. This emotional independence creates healthier connections. Relationships begin to feel like choices rather than obligations. You engage because you want to, not because you're afraid not to. There's often a period during this phase where your life looks quieter on the outside, but richer on the inside. Fewer distractions, fewer compulsions, fewer emotional highs and lows. This can feel unfamiliar if chaos once felt normal. But this quieter state is where integration happens. Insights that once felt abstract begin to show up in behavior. Boundaries are enforced without drama. Needs are expressed without apology. Silence is no longer something to escape. You also start recognizing that self-trust isn't built through confidence, it's built through consistency. Each time you listen to yourself, follow through on rest, or honor a boundary, something repairs internally. The nervous system learns that you are reliable, that you won't abandon yourself when things get uncomfortable. This internal reliability becomes the foundation for resilience. You don't feel invincible, you feel grounded. Old fears may still arise, but they don't dictate your decisions. Fear becomes something you acknowledge rather than obey. This is a critical shift. Many people wait for fear to disappear before moving forward. But fear rarely disappears. It just changes volume. What changes here is your relationship to it. You stop letting fear drive the car. It can ride along, but it no longer chooses the destination. As this continues, you may find that your definition of success changes. It becomes less about achievement and more about alignment. Less about approval and more about integrity. Less about how things look and more about how they feel internally. This redefinition protects you from recreating the conditions that once led to collapse. You're no longer chasing relief, you're building sustainability. The breakdown didn't make you fragile. It revealed where you were already fragile and gave you the opportunity to strengthen what actually matters. And even though the process is ongoing, something essential has already changed. You are no longer disconnected from yourself. That connection becomes your compass, guiding you quietly, steadily forward. As this internal compass strengthens, you begin to recognize how much of your past suffering came from self-abandonment rather than circumstance. You stayed in situations that drained you, not because you didn't know better, but because you didn't yet trust yourself enough to leave. You silenced discomfort because you believed endurance was the same as strength. The breakdown interrupts that pattern. It teaches you, through experience rather than advice, that betraying yourself always comes at a cost. This realization isn't harsh, it's clarifying. It shifts responsibility inward, not as blame, but as power. There is also a deep recalibration of self-worth that happens quietly during this phase. Before, your worth may have been tied to usefulness, productivity, resilience, or being needed. After the breakdown, worth becomes intrinsic. You begin to feel, rather than intellectually understand, that you don't need to earn rest, love, or space. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you selective. You stop overgiving to prove value and start giving where it feels mutual and sustainable. That alone changes the entire emotional economy of your life. You may notice that your tolerance for emotional manipulation drops dramatically. Guilt, pressure, or subtle invalidation that once worked on you now feels obvious, not enraging, just transparent. This isn't because you've hardened, but because your nervous system no longer confuses intensity with truth. You can feel someone else's emotions without absorbing them. You can witness disappointment without collapsing into responsibility. This emotional differentiation is a hallmark of genuine healing. At the same time, compassion deepens, not the self-sacrificing kind, but the grounded kind. You understand suffering more clearly now, both in yourself and others. But you also understand that empathy does not require self-erasure. You can care without rescuing, listen without fixing, support without abandoning yourself. This balance is something you couldn't access before the breakdown because you were still operating from survival. Another subtle shift is how you relate to the future. Instead of obsessively planning or catastrophizing, you begin living closer to the present. Not in a reckless way, but in an embodied one. You realize that most clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from staying connected to yourself moment by moment. The future becomes something you move toward, rather than something you anxiously manage. There may be moments where you grieve the person you were before everything fell apart. Not because that version was better, but because it was familiar. There is a strange comfort in familiar pain. Letting it go can feel like losing a language you once spoke fluently. But as you sit with that grief, you also recognize that the old version of you was doing the best it could with the tools it had. Honoring that truth allows you to move forward without resentment toward your past. As time goes on, you stop needing the breakdown to justify your boundaries or your changes. You no longer explain yourself with stories of burnout or suffering. Your choices stand on their own. You rest because rest is necessary. You leave because staying doesn't align. You speak because silence would be a betrayal. This quiet confidence isn't loud or performative. It's settled. You also become less interested in being understood by everyone, not because you don't care, but because you no longer need universal validation to trust your reality. Misunderstanding stops feeling like danger. Disapproval stops feeling like rejection. You realize that being at peace with yourself matters more than being palatable to others. That realization alone would have been impossible before something broke. What emerges from all of this isn't a perfected version of you. It's a more integrated one. Someone who can hold complexity without collapsing. Someone who can feel deeply without drowning. Someone who no longer needs pain to get their attention because they've learned how to listen before the breaking point arrives. And that is where the breakdown truly begins to reveal its purpose. Not as a moment of failure, but as the turning point where self-awareness finally became unavoidable. As this awareness stabilizes, you begin to notice how differently you move through moments that once would have unraveled you. Discomfort still arises, but it no longer escalates into catastrophe. There's an internal pause now, a brief moment where you register what's happening before reacting. That pause is not accidental. It's the space where your nervous system has learned that not every emotional spike requires defense. In that space, you choose presence over panic, curiosity over judgment. You may start recognizing how much of your former anxiety was rooted in anticipation rather than reality. The mind was always scanning ahead, preparing for outcomes that hadn't happened yet. After the breakdown, this habit weakens, not because you've become careless, but because you've learned that your system can survive uncertainty. You've already lived through internal collapse and discovered that it didn't destroy you. That realization alone reduces fear's authority. Emotionally, there's a growing sense of permission. Permission to feel what you feel without rushing to justify it. Permission to change your mind. Permission to outgrow things without needing a dramatic reason. This permission is deeply regulating because it removes internal conflict. You're no longer fighting yourself while trying to live your life. That inner alignment conserves enormous amounts of energy. You may also notice that your intuition becomes clearer, not louder. It doesn't shout or demand. It presents itself quietly, often as a subtle discomfort or ease. Before, these signals were drowned out by overthinking or people-pleasing. Now, they register. And when you act on them consistently, trust deepens. You stop second-guessing every decision because your body begins confirming what your mind already suspects. Another change emerges in how you experience setbacks. They no longer feel like regressions into failure, but reminders to recalibrate. When something doesn't work, you don't immediately internalize it as proof that you're broken. You assess, you adjust, you continue. This emotional flexibility protects you from spirals. You bend instead of break. There's also a growing tolerance for emotional neutrality. Not everything needs to be intense, meaningful, or transformative. Ordinary moments become acceptable again. Quiet mornings, simple routines, unremarkable days. This might sound insignificant, but it's a major shift for anyone who lived in emotional extremes. Stability stops feeling boring and starts feeling safe. You may realize that you no longer crave the validation you once chased so relentlessly. Praise feels nice, but it doesn't define you. Criticism may sting, but it doesn't dismantle you. Your sense of self is anchored internally now. This doesn't make you immune, it makes you resilient. You can engage with the world without losing yourself in it. As this continues, you start noticing how rarely you abandon yourself compared to before. You speak up sooner. You rest earlier. You leave situations that don't align without waiting for collapse to justify it. These choices don't feel dramatic. They feel natural. That's how you know the change is real. It's no longer something you perform, it's how you live. The breakdown no longer defines you, but it remains a reference point. Not as a wound, but as a reminder of what happens when self-awareness is postponed too long. You don't fear returning to that place. You respect it. You understand that listening early is the real breakthrough, and collapse is only the last resort when listening is ignored. Something inside you has learned how to hear itself now. And once that capacity exists, life no longer needs to shout to get your attention. What you've been experiencing was never a flaw in you. It was a signal from you. A signal that the way you were living, coping, enduring, or disappearing inside yourself could not continue without consequence. The breakdown didn't arrive to destroy you. It arrived because something wiser within you refused to let you keep surviving at the cost of yourself. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back to the old version. Not because you failed, but because you finally saw clearly. A true breakthrough doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like relief, like no longer needing to fight yourself to exist, like choosing alignment over approval, presence over performance, truth over endurance. You don't become fearless, you become honest. And honesty quietly reorganizes your life from the inside out. You stop needing collapse to wake you up because you've learned how to listen before the breaking point. That is the real transformation. If this message resonated with you, if it helped you see your own struggles with more clarity and self-respect, support PSYCHOVEST by liking this video, sharing it with someone who may need it, and subscribing to the channel. These conversations matter, and your engagement helps them reach the people who are still standing in the middle of their own breaking point, wondering if there's meaning on the other side. Your breakdown was never the end of you. It was the moment you stopped abandoning yourself. And from that moment on, everything begins to change.